So, welcome everyone. Today we are joined by Jennifer Doleac to discuss her new book, The Science of Second Chances, A Revolution in Criminal Justice. Jen is an economist who has spent 15 years studying crime and criminal justice, and she was part of a small cohort of economists who helped build the discipline of the economics of crime into what it is today. And after a long career in academia, she's now the executive vice president of criminal justice at Arnold Ventures, one of the largest private funders of evidence-based criminal justice research in the US. She also hosts the Probable Causation podcast. Welcome, Jen.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this. I'm excited to have this conversation.
So this book draws on 15 years of economic research and real-world experiments across the criminal justice system, and you trace everything from a defendant's first arrest through prison and reentry and the impact on their families. And you make the case that we can reduce both crime and incarceration if we give people second chances when appropriate, commit to testing what actually works, and just stop assuming that good intentions are good enough for good policy. And as a result of that, you've also upset progressives, conservatives, public health advocates, everyone across the board. So tonight we're going to discuss the evidence, how it's actually being implemented, and what makes you hopeful about criminal justice reform. So just to kick things off, I'm curious, how does an economist end up studying crime? You came into this field with a PhD at Stanford and a newspaper article about DNA databases. So tell us about your journey and how it ended up leading to this book.
Yeah, so economics is really a toolkit. So economists think a lot about how people respond to incentives, trade-offs, opportunity costs, all of those kinds of concepts. Those can be applied to a really wide variety of settings. There are economists who study health and education and public finance and all kinds of things, in addition to GDP and money that people normally associate with economics. And economists are also much more obsessed than most social scientists with distinguishing correlation from causation. And so we're always looking for either opportunities to run randomized field experiments or looking for natural experiments that can divide people or places into treatment and control groups as if we were in a lab. And so that's always, I think to most economists and most applied microeconomists, that's the fun part of research is really hunting for these natural experiments, and that are, people are always wowed in seminars when you have a really clever one. And so that's something that I think the criminal justice policy space just really needs is people who have the toolkit to really understand what works, what's effective, what's more effective than the other options, as well as that lens about how, where are incentives aligned, how are people respond to incentives, how can we make incentives better aligned to reach our goals. And so yeah, I went to grad school. I went to get a PhD in economics because I loved economics. I loved the toolkit, but didn't really know what I'd be applying it to. And then spent a lot of those years just hunting around for natural experiments, as a lot of PhD students do, and read this newspaper article about law enforcement DNA databases. And the idea of the article was that, it's just laying out that across the United States, different states have different policies about which charges or convictions, which types of crime qualify someone to be added to their state's DNA database. And so that sets up this situation where you can have identical offenders in neighboring states, and one goes in the database and the other one doesn't. And isn't this a crazy policy? And as this is no way to run, criminal justice policy. And that might be true, but it's a great natural experiment to test what the impact of DNA databases are. And so that became my dissertation. And then, as you said, I finished my PhD at a time where there were some senior people who were really trying to build this field, really from the ground up. And I, happened to come out at that time when there was a conference of a bunch of other junior people who were just starting out. And it's a wonderful group of people. And we're all, really eager to try to make the world a better place. And so those people really became great friends and colleagues over the years. And uh, I think all of us were a little nervous to go into this field that was so new. It was definitely a professional risk, but um, it's a really important policy space, and there are so many interesting questions in it. And so here I am, many, many years later, all in on crime.
Awesome. So we'll definitely talk about more of your research, including the DNA databases. But before we get there, one thing that I've seen in research and also in the criminal justice space is that everyone claims to be evidence-based. It's kind of a branding exercise, but you write about a hierarchy of evidence, why there's like a gold standard for research. So, for all of us who are reading about criminal justice and evidence-based policy in the news and are hearing competing claims, can you tell us a bit about how to engage with this and also set up a frame for engaging with the rest of what we're going to discuss today?
Yeah, so there's a wide array of types of evidence that might be useful in informing our conversations and our policies. What I'm particularly interested in is the kind of evidence that tells us what's the impact of some intervention on an outcome we care about. So what is the impact of this GED program on recidivism for people, in prison? Or what's the impact of police on crime? So really trying to measure what's the causal effect. You have correlations in the data, but to what extent did A cause B? Did A cause B, and if so, by how much? What was the size of that impact? And that is really important to nail down if we want to do some good cost benefit analyses and figure out how to allocate our scarce resources, which is really what economists care about at the end of the day. And measuring those causal effects is much easier said than done because in the real world, it's really hard to tell just at a glance, whether police are causing crime or crime is causing cities to hire more police, right? You see that in, for the longest time, it turned out we thought looking at the data that if anything, police were causing more crime because you only saw correlations between more police and more crime. And it wasn't until economists brought in a natural experiment where they use kind of election cycles or other kinds of clever scenarios that divided places into treatment and control groups, that we were able to break that correlation and get some traction on the causal question of whether police caused crime or the other way around. At this point, we know there's lots of solid evidence that that hiring more police reduces crime, and so that's actually like a very real example of a place that the consensus has changed in the literature based on being able to find these natural experiments. And so what we're always looking for is something that approximates a lab experiment. And that lab experiment, I think we're used to being able to think or like in medical trials, say people are randomized to be in a treatment or control group. And the reason we randomize is because we always worry if people are choosing to go into the treatment or control group, there might be some reason that they chose. Maybe they're more motivated, or maybe they're more interested in the treatment. They think it might work for them or something. And so we're always worried about that underlying difference that drove the choices, and that those underlying differences are actually why we're seeing different outcomes. And so if you randomize people into treatment and control groups, then you're not worried about that anymore, right? It's only the treatment that's different between these two different groups of people. And so then we need to look for opportunities in the real world to do that. And then the whole game in this space is how good an experiment can you find in the real world? Randomization is the best case scenario, but it's not always possible. But we do have lots of situations that get close to this. So we can't randomly send people to prison, but we do randomly assign cases to different judges, and different judges have different preferences about how harsh or lenient to be. And so randomly assigning people to different judges effectively randomizes them to a greater or lower likelihood of going to prison. And so there are lots of scenarios like that in the real world that approximate that randomized experiment we really want to find. And the key is basically arguing that your control group is is identical to the treatment group in all ways except for the treatment.
Thank you. One thing that you mentioned are incentives, and people who commit crime, like the rest of us, are weighing the costs and benefits. And this is like a standard framing in the Economist Toolkit. And you talk about how one way to disincentivize them is to raise the cost. So things like longer sentences, which are often like the hammer that people go to try and solve the problem. But another is to raise the probability of getting caught. And Sometimes that's hard because it's hard to have police solve cases more quickly. But there are some interventions that work surprisingly well and are cheap, like DNA databases. Can you tell us a bit about that and also why increasing punishment typically doesn't work very well because of just how people who are about to commit crime are thinking about their decision?
Right. So I think most economists are generally inclined to think people respond to incentives. Of course, that's an empirical question. We can go out and test it. But there is a lot of evidence at this point that even people who are committing crime are thinking about incentives and weighing the costs and benefits. And we see that show up in lots of different scenarios. But if we think about wanting to change people's behavior and deter people from committing crime, what we want to be doing is is think about, how can you either make crime more costly or reduce the benefits of committing crime? And so for a very long time in the United States and other countries too, we focused on the length of the punishment as being the main way to increase the cost of committing crime. And that sounds good. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to try. But it turns out that most people who are on the margin of committing crime just aren't thinking very far ahead. And so in econ terms, they're discounting the future really heavily. They're just, everyone cares a little bit less about the future than they care about today because the future is uncertain. But the type of person who's on the margin of committing crime is even more present focused than average. And so if the main way that we're trying to deter crime is going from a 1 year sentence to a 2 year sentence to a 10 year sentence, and this person isn't thinking past next week, none of that matters, right? None of that is factoring into their calculus today about whether to go out with the friends that always get them into trouble or to steal this car. And so the game then shifts, or we should be focusing our attention instead on increasing the probability of any consequences. And currently in the United States, the probability that cases are solved or that crimes are solved is pretty low. So it's about 50 to 60% if you commit murder. That's the chance that you're going to get arrested for it. That's just an arrest, forget conviction and whatever else. So it's like a coin flip if you commit murder. And that's the obviously most serious crime with the highest clearance rates. Once you get down to like burglary, motor vehicle theft, much less lower level petty theft, the probability is like 5, 10%, maybe 15%. And so if you've got a really low probability of getting caught, even if there's a threat of a really long sentence, it's basically like a lottery. It's like a negative lottery. You might get very unlucky and get caught. And in that case, you go to prison for a really long time. But if you're not thinking that far ahead anyway, then all you're seeing is you're probably not going to get caught. And so if you can shift the focus and the emphasis to finding ways to increase the probability of facing any consequence at all, negative consequence, or in other scenarios, you could think about increasing the probability of seeing the benefits or the payoff to good behavior, focusing on that probability, that consistency of consequences, then that's where you get behavior change. And so, this is I have a story in the book about a colleague who passed away a few years ago named Mark Kleiman, who used to tell this story about how, if you're raising kids and you tell your kid not to take cookies from the cookie jar, and you sort of like every day you see the cookies, the number of cookies in the cookie jar going down, you know that they're taking cookies, but you just always sort of shake your head and remind them not to take any cookies. And then one day you get fed up and to say, you're grounded for 5 years. Like that, there's no way that would change their behavior. That's just kind of a crazy thing to do if you're raising kids, right? You need consistent consequences, and they don't need to be super severe. And so it's the same thing in any setting. Having consistent, reliable consequences, that's how you get behavior change. And it's simply the opposite of how we structure our criminal justice system to get today.
So, on the topic of having consequences, you talk about diversion in the book or helping first-time offenders avoid being pulled into the criminal justice system. And sometimes people conflate this with an argument for decriminalization, but you talk about how there are consequences here. You're arrested, you're booked, you're brought into court, and this is an important distinction, and can shape you and deter you. Can you tell us about whether this can be successfully implemented in practice if people start having the assumption that they're not going to be convicted?
Yeah. Yeah. So the natural experiments that were used to look at this were things like cases being assigned to different district attorneys, and so you wind up with a harsh prosecutor versus a lenient prosecutor. So you maybe get lucky and your case is dropped, or there's some sort of policy change that provides an incentive to use more or fewer deferred adjudications, so you get kind of a second chance at avoiding a criminal record. And all of these studies are really finding that helping erring toward leniency, helping people avoid that first criminal record is really it reduces recidivism dramatically. And so the punchline there is for a lot of people, just that first arrest, that first appearance in court is enough of a wake-up call. Like that's the rock bottom moment that it will get a lot of people to change their ways. We don't have to saddle them with a criminal record that makes it harder for them to get a job and find a place to live in order to make that point, basically. And that all that stuff actually just makes it harder for people to course correct. And so yeah, then the question is like, well, what's the policy based on this? And it seems very obvious to me that if we just had a policy that said everyone gets one free shoplifting charge, right? Like you get a lot more shoplifting. Like clearly we cannot have a policy like that. So it really is about finding a way to just shift the default from erring toward prosecuting to erring toward leniency, toward avoiding that conviction. And there are examples of this. So in the context I was studying with nonviolent misdemeanor cases where some people got lucky and just had their case dropped in that first hearing, the district attorney we were working with actually had implemented a policy of she called it a presumption of non-prosecution. So again, it really was just shifting this default, and it just moved the needle a little bit from maybe they were dismissing 30% of cases before to now they're dismissing 50% of cases. So it's not going from 0 to 100. The individual assistant district attorney still had discretion about what to do with each case, but it just kind of like nudged everyone in a certain direction. You can have a policy like that. That was certainly effective. One of my favorite examples that, my colleagues always laugh, but I'm totally serious about this. If we want to kind of push decision makers in a direction while still giving them lots of discretion to do what they want, is if we know that it would be beneficial to err in a certain direction, give them lots of paperwork to do if they go the other way, right? They still have like it's just like a little bit of an incentive to do more of what we're hoping they will do, but they still if they really think it's worth prosecuting this person, they'll fill out those extra couple forms. And so there are ways we can nudge behavior like that to get what we want and to move in this direction without having a blanket policy that says anyone it's for their first charge, they're not prosecuted.
And the findings that you share on these diversion experiments, like dropping charges for first-time misdemeanor defendants in Suffolk County, cut future criminal complaints by 53%. Similarly, in Harris County, you cut convictions by nearly half. And you call these free lunches, which are almost unheard of in economics. So why do you think there are so many free lunches in the criminal justice space, at least in the United States?
Yeah, and it's probably not limited to the United States. I mean, I honestly think it's because we haven't been super serious in this policy space about focusing on testing what we're doing and seeing if it's effective. And so we do have there's a lot of low-hanging fruit around. Like we're not stuck in a situation where we have to battle over like, do we want more harms from the system, or do we want more crime? Like and just assuming I've seen Jens would give a talk about like assuming we're on like the production possibility frontier for the economists in the room. And it's like the only thing we can do is see like where on the frontier we are, but we're acting optimally. And so it's just a balance it's just a tug of war. We're really far from any sort of efficient optimum. And so that gives us just a lot of room for win-win situations. And this is one of them, right? It turns out we can have less crime for less money and less harm from the system. And there are just a ton of examples like this where we're simply not using our resources anywhere near cost effectively. And that's great news in a situation where we have really tight budgets and state and local levels across the country. Um, I would say the federal level, but we don't really try to balance our budget there anymore. So state and local governments do have to balance their budgets, and they care about that. And everyone's struggling with, where do we make cuts? How do we make all of this work? How do we get more public safety when we have even less money than we did in the past? The good news is there's plenty of room for improvement. We can get less crime for less money, and we just need to be a little bit smarter and more strategic about how we're implementing what we're trying, and focus more on, testing what we're doing so that we can stop doing the stuff that doesn't work, and try to find stuff that does work.
And that's really exciting. Like, who doesn't love free lunches,
Totally,
especially for
exactly.
difficult problems?
Yes.
Um, so I know we've covered some ground. I do want to pause and encourage questions and comments from the audience on anything that we've covered thus far. If not, I'm also happy to keep going, but we'll pause here and see if anyone wants to raise their hand. Nate.
Sure, I'll go. Hi.
Hi.
So one of the things that seems like it works well within the SCF framework, is traffic cameras, right? Like they're able to catch people, they're certain, and like you do get less speeding, I believe, from them. They work. But people also hate them.
Yes.
Uh, do you think that people are just wrong and need to be convinced? And there's I don't know, public messaging campaign that like, hey, actually, you should like these, or like, does this say something about what the goals of like the public is that is contrary to the things that you're measuring as an economist?
Yeah, great question. Um, I I think there is a broader conversation that we're having about a lot of high tech tools and cameras and everything else. And there's like a surveillance component. So there's like license plate readers and all of those things. I think that is different from the reason people hate traffic cameras. I think the reason people hate traffic cameras is because they hate getting tickets. And I think a lot of people who get tickets from red light cameras or speeding cameras are used to being able to talk their way out of tickets. And then they can't when there's just a camera that automatically sends them one. And that is really unfortunate because we know that like consistent consequences are really effective. They do get people to slow down. It's also more fair, right? So if we worry about racial disparities in the criminal justice system, an uneven allocation or use of the justice system, having a camera that just can say you are over the speed limit, you get a ticket, feels very fair and very effective and justified to me. But yeah, I think the reason that I mean, in Texas, they banned red light cameras several years ago, and I think honestly, it's just because people are used to being able to talk their way out of tickets, and now they don't get to anymore. So I don't know. Maybe that just means we need to either raise the speed limits or make the tickets lower or something. But I don't think it's about the surveillance component, which is a different, I think it's also a perfectly reasonable conversation to have, but I think it's different. What do you think? Does
I
that sound right to you or?
My guess would be something like the person who is speeding doesn't feel like they're doing any harm. Like this is a harmless act that like I shouldn't be punished for because I didn't crash, I didn't hit anybody.
Mhm.
And so like I'm uh I feel justified in doing what I was doing. And like some of that has to be like a statistical argument that like, okay, yeah, but if you're 0.2% more likely to end up hitting somebody, like, and then you multiply that by the number of cars that are on the road, like you end up with 40,000 traffic deaths a year,
Right.
which is a crazy high number. So like, yeah, I don't know. The 0.2% is made up, but it might be on the order of that, and that might be a very significant thing. And it's just hard to convince somebody that like the thing that they're doing has a 1 in 500 chance of causing harm, and that they need to change because of that. I don't know. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it might just be about, if we think the speed limit is unreasonable, right? If it's like, look, it's 10 o'clock at night, there's no one on the road, driving 25 miles an hour on a highway seems silly. I should be able to go, or like driving 60, I should be able to go 80 when there's no other cars here. Maybe we should have dynamic speed limits or something. But I think that's an argument about like we don't think the rule is correct, in which case we should change the rule. But if we've got a speed limit, feels like we should be enforcing it and not have it be arbitrary or up to an individual officer to decide who's breaking the law. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it would be great if we could figure this out because having a system where there are rules that are um, consistently enforced, it just helps everyone figure out what they're supposed to be doing, right? If the enforcement of the speed limit depends on who the cop is that's on duty that day, that doesn't help anybody. And so and it's also doesn't provide much faith in the system if different people have to abide by different rules. Um, and and when we really do want people to obey the speed limit because it is dangerous otherwise, then we need them to know that they're going to get caught if they don't. And so, um, yeah, I personally think it's really unfortunate that people hate these traffic cameras as much as they do because they seem like a really good tool.
I I agree with those points. I think in this specific like instance, maybe
Uh-huh.
Waymo's just solved the problem for us.
I think that
Um,
might be true. I think this all
yeah,
might be a moot point, and all these self-driving cars are actually that is going to be the ticket here. That's the
yeah.
solution. Yep.
Cool. DJ, and then I'll call on Sydney.
Oh, you're muted.
I have a question that's kind of more in frustration than anything. I mean, as an economist, the original name of the field was political economy. And it seems like criminal justice is heavily weighted to the political side more than the economy side of the equation. People tend to vote for, retribution. Tough on crime has been a campaign promise since time immemorial. So,
Yeah.
I mean, have you thought through the ways to sort of message this and get politicians to take these ideas seriously?
Yeah. Yeah. So I now am at a philanthropy and policy organization called Arnold Ventures. And so our main goal is evidence-based policy. That's why they hired a researcher to run their criminal justice program. But the other goal is bipartisan change. So the other focus is really we don't waste our time trying to get just one party or the other on board because then when the party, we change who's in office and then the policy changes. And so we kind of view the main durable path to change as being looking for bipartisan consensus. And I think the good thing here is that there are lots, I think when you actually look at the evidence, most of the solutions that are on the table are not the solutions that you hear about on cable news that have been tied to one party or the other. Um, I work very hard to not be associated with either team. As we were saying at the very start, like I've managed to annoy or frustrate people on all sides here. And I think that's because the evidence doesn't align with either party, right? You have some things that the left gets right and some things that the right gets right. And a whole bunch of stuff that both parties get wrong. And so I'll give you I mean, I think this example of focusing on the swiftness and certainty of punishment rather than severity is a place that we're seeing a real potential for bipartisan reform because the traditional arguments that you'll hear on cable news are either you've got the far left saying you need to just solve poverty. That's how you reduce crime. And the far right is saying you need to lock everybody up. Some people are just bad people and you need to lock them up forever. And I think the middle 90% of America looks at that and is just very frustrated and doesn't like either of those answers. And so you have something like solve more crimes faster. That is evidence-based. The evidence is much more on the side of that policy solution than either of those extremes. And it gives those on the right an opportunity to say, well, I mean, that's tough on crime too, right? Solving crime is certainly very important if I care about accountability. And people on the left are saying, well, yeah, the crimes that aren't being solved right now are, those in poor and minority communities. Those are the homicides that are going unsolved each year. And so everybody can get on board with solving crimes faster. And we are seeing that in across the country. So there's states, a wide variety of states that are too many to list, where we're seeing bipartisan pairs of legislators introducing either expansions of DNA databases or the Victim Act, which is really focused on providing resources to police to solve more crimes faster and improve investigations. So I think that's an example of a place where we can break out of these old stale conversations. And honestly, just makes me, I'm just such an optimist about this policy space, partly because of what you're describing. I think the policy conversation on criminal justice has been so stale and so focused on these fringe ideas for so long. And coming from academia, I got to the policy space and was like, nobody I know is talking about these ideas, right? Like we know, like there's so many other options out there that aren't attached to either party yet. And so that's just a huge opportunity. And there are a lot of free lunches we can go seize.
Thank you, Sydney.
Hi, thank you so much. This is it's fascinating and amazing. I'm super curious about two different things, actually. One is from an ideological level, some of the things that you just talked about, I was wondering if you could expand on. I know I'm a therapist. I started my career in special ed advocacy, which I thought was something that would be bipartisan, but I found similarly to you that many people were angry about me and felt that what I was doing was, something that was like, something political. And I've since had the experience of like training dogs using our positive dog training and found similarly that sometimes people are really averse to the idea of positive reinforcement because they have in their mind the sense that they need to dominate their dogs. And
Mm,
so I found that like oftentimes the biggest struggle in getting people to change their behavior, I work with in mental health too, is that they have this really strong attachment to punishing what they
mm,
perceive to be bad behavior. Even when they can see in front of their eyes that they can change the behavior, it's really hard for them
yeah.
to confront that. So I'm really curious about that. And I'm also really curious about what you said in terms of solving crimes faster as it relates to the potential risk of surveillance and social control.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious about like the intersections of ideology, things like human rights, how all of that comes into play in your work when you're thinking about pitching your work. So the behavioral economics around people adopting some of this.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's fascinating about people being wed to punishment. I think it makes me think of, the spiel I often give when I talk to policymakers about the evidence around long sentences, which is generally that, from a public safety perspective, putting people into prison for a really long time is just not cost effective, right? But that's not the only reason we put people in prison. And so I have this whole spiel I give about, we put people in prison for at least four different reasons. One is incapacitation. We keep people who are an active public safety threat off the streets, and that reduces crime. The second is deterrence. The experience of prison or the threat of prison will prevent you from committing crime. The third is rehabilitation. Ideally, this is an intervention point. We can give you courses or whatever to put you on a better path. And the fourth is retribution. And that's just you did something bad, you deserve to have something bad happen to you. And I think it's useful to break that out because I, as an economist, can say something about the first three, right? I can say something about whether we are getting some public safety, we are able to reduce crime because of this additional year in prison. Those are empirical questions about whether there's an incapacitation, deterrence, or rehabilitation effect. How much retribution or mercy someone deserves is a matter of moral beliefs, your personal preferences, your own life experience. That is certainly a topic that we hear lots of public conversations about, but it's not something data or the kind of evidence I can generate can provide any useful insight into. And so, but I think the way I try to frame it is, regardless of how much retribution you think someone deserves, so how much harshness you think is warranted, everyone would like more public safety for less money. And so even if we hold the retribution preference constant, we can still move the needle over here and try to get more public safety. Or at least we can say, and maybe this goes to more of your dog training example, just know what you're giving up, right? So if you really fundamentally believe this person deserves 40 years in prison, even when I tell you, like, it's totally fine if you're willing to, like, just from a pure retribution angle, perfectly fine. Your preferences are your preferences. I just want to make sure everyone is fully aware of like how much that costs and what they're paying for that and what the opportunity cost of that is, right? We could be spending, that prison's really expensive. We could be spending all that money on police investigations that would reduce crime a lot. And are we willing to make that trade-off? And this gets to, I think, your second question about like how we weigh these things with civil liberties and people's rights. And I genuinely, like, I am trained to think about trade-offs. I'm trained to help people think through like what are the costs and benefits. And so for tools like cameras or DNA databases or drones as first responders or any of these other new tools that are out there, there is some degree of privacy cost. Those are going to vary from tool to tool. So I try to emphasize, like, don't group them all together. Like, they're all different tools, right? And they all come with different types of costs. But I think having a better understanding of like what the public safety benefit of any given tool is will help us figure out if it's worth the privacy cost. And this question of like, is it right? Is it constitutional? Should we do this? I view as very much not my lane. I am not a lawyer. I am not a philosopher. I'm an economist, right? And so I can help us crunch numbers and optimize how we allocate our resources to meet some goal. And I don't view it as my role to tell you what your goal should be or what your constraints are. You tell me what your goal is and what your constraints are, and I will help optimize within those constraints. And so, yeah, it's interesting. I've been on this book tour, right? And I've been having a bunch of these conversations over the past week, and with a lot, mostly with lawyers. The criminal justice field is full of lawyers, and they're all, they have gotten a lot of these questions about like how I think about these normative questions. And my honest answer is, I'm really glad there are other people out there whose expertise is in thinking through those questions, because that's not my expertise, and I don't view it as my lane. So, yeah, but always, happy to like name the trade-off. But I think I view it as just like different people are going to think differently about those types of things.
Thank you. Megan?
Long answer. Hi, Megan.
Hi, Jennifer. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Loving this conversation. So appreciative of you for having it. As you know, I'm really passionate about fair chance hiring, so would love to just pivot, talk a little bit about like ban the box, which I know you've talked about and you've studied, and how there's quite a few pitfalls and unintended consequences with ban the box, which are well known now. But I'm curious if you have thoughts or ideas on like the ideal vision for policy changes that could help reduce barriers to employment for people with records, whether that's in background screening or anything related to hiring. Yeah, I would love to hear if that's an area that Arnold Ventures is looking at or you personally are interested in.
Yeah, very interested in this. And yeah, my research on Ban the Box is part of what kind of like drew me more and more into thinking about how do we help people who are going through the criminal justice system get onto a better path and break this cycle. So for those who don't know the research on Ban the Box, so basically Ban the Box is a policy that prohibits employers from asking on a job application if someone has a criminal record. So traditionally there's been a little box you check, do you have a felony record? And so the idea is that banning that box, banning that question will help people with criminal records get their foot in the door and have a chance to get a job that otherwise we know that employers discriminate against people with records. And the problem with this is that if employers care about a record, which they seem to because they are so reluctant to hire people with criminal records, if they care about the record and now you tell them they can't ask, well, then they aren't just going to treat everyone equally. They're going to try to guess who has a record. And when they try to guess, they use other information that they do see. And in the United States, race is going to be the most salient characteristic that is correlated with whether someone has a recent conviction. And so what we wind up seeing in practice is that young Black men with more limited education are now much less likely to get a job because men in that group who don't have a criminal record now can't signal their clean record up front. So this was actually, in some ways, you can think of the box as being a solution to a previous or a partial solution to a previous problem where there was more rampant racial discrimination. And part of the reason for the racial discrimination is that employers were worried that young Black men had criminal records. And so you can ask now, people without records get jobs. We still have these people left who don't have who have a record. So what do we do next? So this is something my team is thinking a lot about, and I'm thinking a lot about. My inclination as an economist would be to think about employers not as like the enemy that we need to somehow like force into hiring people that they don't want to hire, but think of them as just rational actors. In some ways, employers are the most rational actors. They're profit maximizers, right? Like that should be the goal. They're humans, but they have a clear profit incentive to hire people who are going to be a good fit for the job. And most business owners I know are desperate for people who would be a good, reliable employee, and they wish they could start yesterday. And so the idea that somehow they're passing up amazing employees just, for no good reason, just doesn't seem right. Like there's some disconnect there. And so what seems to be going on is that there are people out in the world who have criminal records who would make amazing employees, and you have employers who are looking for amazing employees, and these people can't find each other. Like the matches aren't being made. And so that's a market failure, right? That's just fundamental market failure that everyone would be better off if we could help these two groups find each other. And so what can we do to kind of help them find each other? You could imagine interventions like, and you see this in the real world. You see different kind of like reentry programs or rehabilitation programs. I mean, who knows if the programs themselves are actually doing anything, but the fact that someone's made it through the program becomes a positive signal, and certain programs become feeders to certain employers because people know anyone who's gotten through that program is going to be really reliable and a good fit. We're thinking a lot about insurance as a way forward here. So thinking about one reason employers are worried about hiring people with records is because of the risk associated with a record. Could be negligent hiring risk. It could be, I guess the worst case scenario is that someone commits a crime on the job. And so thinking about ways to basically insure employers against that risk and shift the cost of that from the employer to society. Like all of us would benefit if this employer gave this person a chance. And I feel like I'm not explaining this very well, but basically the idea here is like we can think about then why the market isn't just providing this insurance up front. So we know there's a really cool field experiment out there that tried different kinds of incentives to get HR managers to be willing to hire someone with a record in kind of an incentive compatible way. Their jobs became open to people with records if they said yes. And insurance, dollar for dollar insurance was the most effective path forward. So you could get providing $5,000 of crime and safety insurance increased people's willingness to hire people with records as much as an 80% wage subsidy. So that's like, 80%. It's like the platform or the researchers would have paid 80 cents of every dollar the person was being paid. And so we're looking for ways to be able to actually scale this in the real world. And my current hunch for why this isn't just being provided, why the market isn't providing this, is that insurers just genuinely don't know how to price the risk. They haven't covered this group before. And so they don't know what the cost would be. And so that's a perfect place for a philanthropy to come in and provide catalytic funding, cover the insurance and the losses for a certain amount of time, collect the data, and then, hand that over to the actuaries, and then they can crunch the numbers and know what the price is. Now, my hunch is we're also always going to need to subsidize this to some extent, because part of the challenge here is that there is another market failure that we all want we would all benefit. There are positive externalities to the community if employers hire someone with a record. And so we're going to need to, in that case, we're going to need there, it means there, the market's always going to just like under provide jobs for people with records. And because of those positive externalities, that would justify a government subsidy of this kind of insurance. But anyway, that is one example of the kind of thing we're thinking of to try to directly address this, the concern that employers have, and see if we can move the needle on this a bit. And I love seeing, and obviously people like you are out there trying new things also. And I think this is just a place where, I mean, across the board, we just need people to be trying new stuff. And then like, let's go. We know that the stuff we're doing is not working. Let's try new stuff and do it in a way that we can actually measure what the impact is. And I think we just need to keep our eye on the ball of solving the problem. I think it's a really important problem that people with records cannot get jobs. And I think it is an important enough problem that I am extremely impatient about being stuck with policies that don't work.
Yeah, as I was reading your book, I was trying to find patterns for what works. One is this thread of information, like giving people the information that they need to make an informed decision. And another thing that kept coming up is some of the interventions that work tend to constrain discretion on either sides of the criminal justice system or shift the default action. And the takeaway for me was, perhaps you agree or disagree, is that individual judgment, even if it's well-intentioned, just doesn't work at scale. And you just need to design the right defaults, and prevent people from having to make a good call in every single case. So do you agree with that? And if so, like what does that tell us about how we should design some of these systems going forward?
I think that if we know what we want to do, if we know what the right answer is, then leaving it up to human discretion is only risky, right? Because some people are not going to make a different decision. And so if we know what the right answer is, then setting up a default or automating it in some way is helpful. We also have scenarios where we know, for instance, that if we're thinking about releasing people pre-trial or releasing people on parole, there is a strong incentive for the decision makers in those cases to err toward incarceration, because if the person, even if they've got someone who's super low risk, everyone agrees that this person is very unlikely to, do anything wrong when they get out. In the, 1 in a million chance they do something terrible, it's that judge's or parole officer's face that's on the news. It's not, the offender. And so that decision maker then in that moment is like, I don't know, like they seem low risk, but I should be better safe than sorry, And so so finding ways to kind of, use data or use some sort of default to give those decision makers cover, or to not have their own personal reputation be as on the hook, can be useful. I do want to flag here, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who really do not like the idea of just automating a lot of these decisions. And I think part of it is because it's really, we don't really know what the right answer is. We don't know who should be locked up and who should be convicted and for how long. And the upside in this moment where we don't really know the answers to all those questions is that this, natural variation in how different decision makers are going to handle different cases leads to really great natural experiments and leads to more, it helps us understand who's getting it right more often and who's getting it wrong. And then we can try to continue to push people toward the decisions where we're getting better outcomes. But yeah, I don't know. This issue of like, do we just remove all human discretion is controversial, and not everyone's comfortable with it. And I think that's totally reasonable. But then it's a question of just like, how can we help everybody use the information that they do have in the most effective way?
So on that thread of trying things and experimenting, one question that I've always had as I read these studies is, can we extrapolate from them? Like each finding is internally valid for its setting, but what can we learn from Denmark that's applicable in the United States? How many studies do you need to conduct before you have enough evidence to act?
Yeah.
And for evidence-based policy, does that just mean you have to test everything locally, even if it's slow?
Yeah.
Or can you feel confident after a point?
Yeah. I feel like my team asks me this question all the time. How many studies do we need exactly for something to be evidence-based? It's like, is it 2 or 3 or 10? Like, just give us the number. And the answer is it's kind of a professional judgment call. And also, like, I think the way I've come to frame it is the more evidence we have, the more confident we can be that when we go implement this thing in this next place, we're going to see this effect. We're never going to be sure, right? And this is probably just the researcher in me, but I would always love for, wherever we implement it next, why not build in some sort of quasi experiment where we can be learning as we're going? And what's the harm? What's the harm in having more evidence in this new setting, in this new time period? But yeah, I mean the way that we think about this a lot at Arnold Ventures. I mean, basically we fund a lot of research that, if you have an idea that you want to go test in the world, as long as you've got a strong research design, we'll fund it, right? Like we want to just go test stuff. And are really agnostic about what we're testing. We don't want to put our thumb on the scale, in terms of, whose idea is the best idea. But then once there's at least one strong causal study showing that something is effective, then that unlocks more policy and researcher time on our team to try to facilitate replications in different places. And then once we have more than one study, and then that's where it's like it's a little bit ambiguous about how many we need, but like a few, and it's a little bit of a professional judgment call. If it's a couple small studies, then maybe you want more of them. If there are a couple of big national RCTs, and that's maybe you just need a couple. But once we get to a place where we're like, yeah, we're pretty confident that this effect is going to hold, then that unlocks policy and advocacy dollars for us to try to take it to scale. But I'm spending a lot of time, and we have a person that we hired just to try to embed quasi experiments and data access into legislation that we're supporting, because I do want to loop around and study what the impact was. And so I think, ideally, we're just constantly in test, learn, iterate mode. Like I think the idea that we'll ever get to a point where we can just say, great, we solved it, on to the next problem. I think that's how we got ourselves into this mess in the first place. And so it's better to just be assuming that we can always do better, and aim for that.
Yeah, and that makes sense because the world is also always evolving, and
Always changing. Yeah.
what worked
And
yesterday
new
might not work
innovations
today.
come up I mean, there's just always, even if what we're doing now is working well, it just seems crazy not to think that we could do better if we tried new things. So, yeah, we should always be striving for that.
Nate, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So on the topic of iterating and being impatient, I'm like about halfway through the book right now. And one of the chapters talks about the 24/7 sobriety program in South Dakota, right?
Mhm.
And hearing that, I was like, oh, I recognize this because I think I read about it in Vox in like 2016. And the book talks about how it started in 2005. And I'm like, okay, like how does this take 20 years to from we implemented a thing, it's good, we did a study on it, and looking it up, I think it was like a study in South Dakota in 2013 and one in North Dakota in 2021. But like those are the only two I could find, at least on criminalsolutions.gov.
There's one in Montana, and
Okay.
they're cool. Yeah. But
Okay. But like what's the bottleneck here that like is making this take from like implementing in 2005 to like this still is not just a common thing and is like a success story that we should try sort of thing. Like is it getting the study done? Is it getting the ideas to legislators? Is it legislators actually writing the law? Like
yeah.
what's the bottleneck?
Yeah, great question. So I've been in this job about 2.5 years. I think when I first took this job, I assumed that the main constraint and the big fight would be over whether or not we should care about evidence and like whether the science is good and why this study and not that study. And it turns out that most of the conversations I have with policymakers So first of all, it's almost all at the state level. So almost all of our work's at the state level because that's where the interesting criminal justice policy happens. Um, and most state lawmakers I talk to are genuinely, you know, hungry for new ideas, and they don't know researchers. They don't know the evidence. And so most of them are working part-time. They have a full-time job. This legislative gig is up, part-time side hustle for a few months a year where it's super busy. They don't have a staff. And so they're doing the best they can. They're just like Googling and asking their friends and trying to find some experts. But it's been really, I have been amazed that at the openness to research evidence that the and new ideas and bipartisan ideas and all of those things that, I think if you watch cable news, you think are dead, right? Like that none of these things are possible anymore. It's all possible at the state level. They just genuinely are busy and they just don't know people. And I think I've come to think of, I think I'm used to thinking of the advocacy problem as being in some ways, a really human problem. Like maybe people who are trying to make laws don't always, they're not necessarily reading journal articles. It's about who you trust and who you know. And so we spend a lot of our time just trying to put researchers and policymakers in the same room so they can learn from each other and trust each other. But it's the same problem on the research side. Like the reason we don't necessarily have more replications or more new studies is that researchers and practitioners don't know each other and don't trust each other. And so just trying to get everyone, get all these people talking to each other is a really useful way forward. But yeah, like on 24/7 sobriety, I go around talking about that all the time now. And people are like, great. Like, do you have a bill? Like, how do you,
Yeah.
how do we do this? Right. And so it's really, I don't think it's active resistance. I think it's honestly, I mean, I do think that the policy conversation in this space has been really stale for a really long time. That's part of what I'm trying to change, right? I think most of the ideas that people like me know about and think about all the time are just not, they don't get media attention. This is not what lawmakers are used to thinking about or talking about. It's not what most advocates are out there talking about. And so I'm really just I'm trying to get some of this evidence that you read about in a Vox article 10 years ago. Like, how is this not policy everywhere yet? I think there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit here. There's a lot of stuff that we know that we could go implement today that would make a lot of people much better off. And there's really nothing in our way. We just have to get the word out. So yeah, that's why I wrote a book.
It almost sounds like management, like the role of an organization and like management being like, hey, like do this, like you had an idea, like we need to follow up on that. That like, I mean, at the start of my career or whatever, I would have very like underestimated and been like, oh, you don't do anything, I do all the work.
Yeah.
But like when that's lacking, that's the outcome that like people have these ideas and just nothing ever gets implemented. So it almost feels like some sort of CEO or leadership or something that's lacking from there to make that actually happen.
Yeah, or just people are busy, right? And it's like there's a CEO, it's the governor or it's the mayor of the city or whatever, and they've got a bunch of stuff they're trying to do. And 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 so it's and a bunch of different constituents they're trying to keep happy. And so um yeah, but I don't think it's an aversion to these ideas. I think it's really just making sure they have what they need to be able to go implement it. And that takes work, but it is really far from impossible. And so I'm a huge optimist in this space. I think a lot of change is happening. I think a lot more change is possible. And again, it's really helpful that like at the state and local level, they have to balance their budgets. And so it's like they have to be really pragmatic and they're looking for stuff that actually works. So yeah, I think we're on the right track here.
So I think you've mentioned that a lot of your research doesn't focus on like why does crime happen in the first place, but how can we improve things after something has happened. But in the book, you do talk about the fact that we can set people up for success, especially young people, and that there are some effective interventions, especially around education and nutrition, that can work. So, can you speak a little bit about what kind of investments work versus don't? Because often the topic of increasing spending can be unpopular. Like, I think I read this Brookings report that per pupil spending is only weakly correlated with test scores and graduation rates. But you also talk about how spending on school buildings can cut arrests by 20% in Michigan. So I'd love to hear a bit more about your thinking around this and what the research says.
Yes. There so most of the book is really around how do we intervene at each stage of the criminal justice process to break the cycle for an individual. And then in the second part, it's like, okay, now what do we do for their kids? How do we break the intergenerational cycle? And it is much easier to prevent someone's first encounter with the criminal justice system than to try to pull them out afterwards. It is not impossible at any point, right? I think part of what I'm really hoping a takeaway here is that there's a lot we could be doing to use all these different intervention points more effectively. But if we really want to maximize the bang for our buck, focusing on the prevention for and investing in young kids and teens is really cost effective. So yeah, things like early childhood education seems to reduce crime in the future. Reducing exposure to lead for young kids, super important. Increasing access to nutrition is really helpful. It seems in part because better nutrition has a protective effect against toxins in the environment. If you are exposed, if you're tested to have high levels of lead in your blood, one of the things they tell you is to drink a lot of milk, because basically the reason lead is so damaging to brain development is it mimics calcium, and so it latches onto calcium receptors in the brain. And so if you can drink a lot of milk or consume a lot of calcium, that helps crowd out the lead. And so one reason things like SNAP benefits or food stamps might be so effective at reducing crime later on for kids, it might actually be having this protective effect against toxins they're exposed to. And then there's this cool research about the school spending and so these school bond elections where they just barely approve the capital spending or not, and they have the new building, and so you see that those kids criminal justice involvement is lower later. And what seems to be going on there is again, it could be something about kids like hanging out in the school now. They've got a fancy new gym and a new arts department, and so they're willing to go to math class so they can do all of that. But part of it might be the reduction in exposure to toxins. And so, less lead, less air pollution if they've got a good HVAC system and all of that. So there is more evidence building up on this sort of like HVAC system side, like a good air quality is really important. Yeah, I mean, my point with all of those is like there's a bunch we could do that doesn't require like eliminating poverty, right? Because I think that's the big structural change that a lot of people are rooting for. And I think it's wonderful to hope for, and people can do what they can. But I'm very much a pragmatist, and I don't think we're going to eliminate poverty anytime soon. And so it's like, what can we be doing in the meantime that could really move the needle? And there is a bunch of stuff we could do.
Yeah, and it seemed very promising and exciting. Again, like I love all the little free lunches that you write about.
Totally.
Brendan has a question or a comment.
Thank you, and I appreciate you guys putting this on. So you touched on it was a municipal bond election and how that impacted the amount of funding. That also reminds me of an anecdote which you've probably seen many times about the impact around whether or not judges are elected and how that impacts criminal justice outcomes. I'm curious from your perspective, like where is there a clear body of evidence around like more democracy leading to better policy at the margins for the outcomes you care about versus less? And then another thing that you talked about is like budget constraints and things like that. What are often when you're talking to people in the municipal and state governments where you consistently see them spending more on these areas of criminal justice policy or enforcement? And maybe it is just incarceration in prisons, but I'm curious if there are other things around, like, say, I don't know if it's like wages or I know like in a lot of states, like in the Northeast, it's like public sector pensions often act as a drag on the services that we can provide today, but those are very politicized. And so I don't necessarily know if those are the things that you run into in your line of work.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't follow the literature. I know the literature. I know of the literature on the sort of elected judges versus appointed, and used to know what it was finding. I think like one of the big findings there is that if you see judges sort of like cracking down and being tougher on defendants in the lead up to an election. Um, but uh, but I don't know if there's a consensus at this point on like are elected or appointed judges like better writ large. And you can kind of argue it up both ways for sure. What were you going to say?
No, I was gonna say I wasn't sure if like people had followed that down, like different margins of like, whether or not electing sheriffs or things like that also like led to similar effects.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think this is a bigger literature in the political science space, which I don't follow as much as I probably should. Yeah. And then your second question was about, sorry, my
I
brain.
just you see people spending a lot of money on X and you want to
Oh,
shake and be like, no, please spend more money on
yeah.
Y for the love of God, why?
Yes. So incarceration is the big one, mostly because incarceration is super expensive. And so some of that's prison terms, some of it's pretrial detention, right? We do lock up a lot of people who are low-level offenders that don't need to be there, who are not a public safety threat. And so thinking about how can we target that that resource in a more thoughtful way and identify who's high risk and lock them up, but not the low risk people. Um, I think bigger picture, there's just a lot of spending on a lot of programs that um, where we don't have any evidence they're effective. And so it's not that we have evidence that they're not effective. We just don't have any evidence they are effective, and there's no effort to try to see if they're effective, right? It's sort of like everyone has an incentive to just keep believing in it. And so that to me is a missed opportunity. Um, and so I would prefer that we were like, privileging the programs or proposals where there is evidence that this thing is effective, and then everything else kind of has to take a back burner. One set of programs that are fairly popular where there is at this point a lot of evidence that there's no effect, and if anything, a slight detrimental effect are what are called wraparound services. So these are sort of like reentry programs. There are a lot of programs out there that are trying to help um, people with various levels of criminal justice involvement, but especially people coming out of prison. And I think they're very well-meaning in the sense that I think if you look at someone coming out of prison, they just have a lot of challenges they're struggling with. They need to find a job, they need a car, they need somewhere to live, they might need childcare, they need health care, they need like just they need, they need some education, all these things. And it feels like addressing any one of those needs just is barely scratching the surface. Like, how can, you give them a job, but they can't get there. And so like, what's the point? And they don't have anywhere to live. So these programs kind of add on more and more bells and whistles. And there have been some really big RCTs at this point of highly respected programs of this type, randomizing some people to get access to the services and some people not. And they all find no effect at best. And in some cases, the treatment group is more likely to go back to prison than the control group. And so this is interesting because if you just look at like one-off or more targeted types of interventions, like just give people housing or just give people healthcare access, or just give people cognitive behavioral therapy or just give people cash, those are effective. And so it is like, why does doing more not work? And I think there are two possible reasons at this point. One is that when you try to do everything at once, you just wind up not doing anything well. You're just trying to do too much. So that's possible. That's kind of an implementation problem. It's just too hard to do everything at once. The other possibility, um, which is something that a social psychologist started writing about in like the 70s, facing a similar kind of question in the literature, is that especially for this really disadvantaged group, having a program that is very clearly that is trying to do everything for you and that is approaching you as if you just have like so many challenges and need so much help, that basically is communicating to the person that you're someone who cannot do anything by yourself and you need a lot of help. And so maybe it is actually more effective to give people some help and then give them space to rack up some win on their own, just build their sense of agency and confidence. And maybe that's what's going on. It's something about kind of helping people, build their own confidence in the world. And that's hard to do with these more comprehensive programs. I think that, those are speculations, like what the reason is, but whatever it is, these wraparound service programs are not effective. And so I try to say in the book, like, it doesn't mean every single one of those programs does not work, but I think that at this point, the burden of proof has really flipped. Like, the burden of proof really should be on those programs to demonstrate that that they're different. And so we need to be really skeptical of those programs now, I think.
One really quick follow-up on that is, when you're communicating, have you communicated like those findings? Good LaCroix choice, by the way. That's a good one. When you're communicating those findings to people who are actually provisioning and delivering those services, have you had to do that? And like, or is that more like you're writing literature and publishing it? Have you gone and presented to any of these organizations directly, like on your findings from the RCTs, or when you're summarizing this evidence?
Yeah. I don't know that I've definitely talked to a lot of nonprofit providers who work in this space. I don't know that I've presented research findings to them. Um, but I talk to people in the
I,
policy space about it a lot. Yeah.
I guess, let's say when you're communicating ideas in this space, and maybe it's either coming from a place of the research techniques you're using are very technical and
Yeah.
they might not be familiar with them, or they're ideas that maybe the conclusions of the research you're providing are either non-intuitive, or they're maybe not what people want to hear, which it sounds like you do a lot. When
Yes.
you're communicating those ideas to people, what do you find is just like an effective way to allow people to be receptive to
Mhm.
those ideas?
Mhm. I try really hard, and I learned this probably the hard way doing during the Ban the Box conversations about 10 years ago. Also, there's a lot of stuff that happened, I guess, 10 years ago. But have learned over time and try very hard to really establish up front what our shared goals are. Like, our goal here is to help people who are coming out of prison find jobs and reintegrate in society and build a stable life that they're happy with and avoid going back, right? And so we're all trying to do that. And the question is how to do that most effectively. And also the reality is, like, most of our good ideas just don't work, right? Like, these are really hard problems to solve. And so, my main goal is to go out and like test things in the real world so that we can iterate on them. And, if something's not working, I think we all want to know, because we care so much about helping this population. And so if something's not working, we want to find that out as quickly as possible, fail fast so that we can try something else. And I think framing it that way, like, because I think a lot of people hear a call for evidence, or hear, someone like me saying this thing doesn't work, and interpret that as she doesn't care about the goal. And I try very hard to make it clear, like, that is not what's happening. When I say ban the box isn't working, it's not because I don't care about people with criminal records, or I don't think employers should hire them. I am focused on figuring out a way to get more people with criminal records into jobs. And this doesn't seem to work. So what else could we try? And so then the second part of it is really pivoting to, like, what else could we do? What does work? So I think in the wraparound service scenario, saying, like, it turns out wraparound services for some reason aren't effective. But you know what is effective? Giving people healthcare, giving people housing, like just these one-off things, those work. And isn't that interesting? And so, like, what else could we try like that? So really trying to quickly pivot people's attention to what do we try next, rather than, because I think people hear the negative as somehow suggesting we should just not do anything. And that's very much not what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. So, as we wind down to the end of the evening, we've covered a lot of ground. Is there something that we haven't covered, Jen, that you're excited to share or want to talk about?
Oh. I think I'll just reiterate, like, I'm just such an optimist in this space. And another reason I really wanted to write this book is I feel like most books in this space, most cultural touchstones around criminal justice are just very much like they all have this burn it all down kind of feel. It's just like what a mess this system is, right? And it's really hard to read any of these things and think and come away with anything other than just this feeling that this is just kind of hopeless. And that's just not like I've worked in this space for a really long time and now I'm in like closer to the front lines trying to make policy change, and I'm more optimistic than ever. Like there's so much that we know. We're learning more every day. The research is getting better and better. I really feel like it's a golden age for research in this space. Our toolkit for learning is better than it ever was. And on the policy side, people are hungry for just like pragmatic solutions that are not going to be big ideological fights. Like I think people are tired of just this like are you on my team or the other, like whose team are you on? Like it's just so like frustrating and stale. And so yeah, there's just so much good stuff happening in this space. And so I wanted to write a book that was A, communicating that optimism, but B, was leading more with the solutions than the problems, right? I think at this point the problems are well known, but there are things we can do about it that are actually achievable and that don't require a big structural change. That don't require like burning it all down and starting over, which we're not going to do, right? And so what can we do right now to make people's lives better? And there's a ton of stuff. There's a ton of stuff we could do and that we are doing. So I think that's the main thing.
Yeah, I mean, I felt very optimistic about a very hard problem after reading your book, and it made me wish that maybe, so I'm more familiar with the healthcare space in the US, and it made me hope for someone to do this kind of work in healthcare, perhaps, or write something like this. But yeah, just to close things out, I know you've touched on this, but what are you working on next? Are there any cool projects that you wish people would work on that you don't see enough interest in? Yeah, where does it go from here?
Ooh, let's see. So much stuff. There's so much room. One thing that I'm thinking a lot about, my team is thinking a lot about, is opportunities to engage the private sector in solving some of these problems. So, I mean, I think traditionally in this space, a lot of folks who come to criminal justice advocacy are very distrustful of anything about capitalism, right? It's just like if anyone's making money off of something, they must be bad. And I, as an economist, come to this and think, well, if someone can solve our problems for us, then they deserve to make a profit. Like that would be great, right? If we can think of a way to provide a profit incentive to reduce recidivism, like that's a win-win. And so how can we harness market forces to address some of these issues? So some of it is things like, a lot of people like to complain about private prisons. We can just write better contracts with the prisons and make their payments contingent on lower recidivism rates or more safety or whatever it is, whatever outcomes we want them to achieve. And then there's a profit incentive to figure out that problem in a way that there isn't in the public prisons. But there are also a bunch of technical innovations and medical innovations going on that could be real game changers. And so we're looking for opportunities where there are, again, the private sector might be doing something that could have a big public safety impact. And there could be an opportunity either for us to just study what the impact is and understand it better, or for philanthropic capital to be able to, spur those innovations along. So one place we're watching is the use of GLP-1s to treat addiction. That there's a lot of anecdotal evidence at this point that is effective. And so we're talking with some folks about running randomized trials for people who are justice involved and seeing if it helps reduce justice involvement. Gosh, I mean, that's one of those things that's like maybe it's a moonshot, but if that works, that's a game changer in the public safety space, right? We're also really interested in There are studies, but they're mostly descriptive. They're just sort of correlational studies. They're not, and there's like one really small RCT, but it's sort of, yeah, I think right now the evidence is not super strong.
Okay.
We
I
need some
thought I
data.
might have seen something today
Oh,
about that.
today? Oh, well, I
Um,
will look. I'll
I
look
can
for
try
it.
and look it up and see if I can find the link. Yeah.
Yeah, see if you can find the link. That'd be great. Um, and yeah, the other space we're watching is sort of the AI mental health care space. And there's, a lot of people in the news talking about ChatGPT and everyone's using it as a therapist and it's sending people down these terrible rabbit holes. That's obviously bad, but there are organizations, companies that are trying to train AI to provide good mental health interactions and use them in a way that could be either a complement or even, I mean, no one's pitching themselves this way, but as a replacement for therapists in a context where we have a huge workforce shortage in the mental health space. And we know that increasing access to mental health care will reduce crime and recidivism. But if there aren't enough therapists and people do not want to go to therapists, then what can we do? And maybe having an app on your phone that you do want to engage with could be helpful. And so there are things like that that could be really great. Oh, awesome. Pulling it up here.
Yeah, I'll have to read up on that.
Yeah, I'll check.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Um, well, I think that brings us to the end of the evening. Thank you so much for joining us. This was such a fun conversation. And again, I really enjoyed reading your book. I hope more people run experiments in all kinds of sectors in the United States. And excited to see what you keep working on with Arnold Ventures going forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you, everybody, for spending your evening with me. This was delightful. And thanks
Thank
for the
you.
Thank
GLP-1 link.
Bye, everyone.
Great. Bye.